Hi everyone, I'm really excited to interview Keshav Ramaswami. He's currently a master student at Bartlett. In this interview, you will get to know his journey and experience at Bartlett and his studio work and lots of exciting stuff which you generally don't get over internet. So without much ado, we'll jump into the interview. So Keshav, can you take our audience through where you grew up, how did the culture impacted you, and out of all things you can do in life, why you chose architecture?
Mhm, mhm. So yeah, I grew up in Kansas, in the middle of the country in the United States. My parents are both from India. They're both from Madras. And yeah, I grew up there for most of my life. It was 18 years, like everything from, early school, preschool to grade school and everything like that. And then I moved to Brooklyn to study at Pratt Institute for my undergraduate degree in architecture. Yeah, so why architecture? That's a good question. Both my parents are architects. So, and it's actually not because of them why I joined to a certain extent. I was always interested in, like both my parents are architects, but they're also like great visual artists. My dad paints, my mom draws. And so I was surrounded constantly by either, architecture monographs on Louis Kahn or Corbusier or like modernist stuff, or just older books. And then on the other hand, I was also very interested in just like visual languages and like painting. I painted a lot as a kid, drew a lot as a kid, still do. And yeah, I started to really get into science. And I did cancer research for 5 years during high school. And I was going to the lab every day after school or almost every day after school and just like working on science projects and stuff like that I would submit to national competitions and do little conferences and stuff like that. I went to a few of them around the country with other young scientists like myself who was doing projects in labs. And that was like ages 14 to 18, around then, like high school-ish. And then towards the end of high school, I was figuring out like, okay, well, I need to figure out what I'm going to do for school for college. And I basically applied half to schools for biochemistry and biomedicine and half to schools for architecture. And it was really just a matter of like my parents being like, look, you've got these kind of two main career paths. Do you want to also apply to architecture? Are you interested in that? I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, why not, right? Like, there's architecture seems like a solid logical choice between like issues of research, structure, rigor, things that you would approach within a lab or a scientific process, but then also just obvious like creative, compositional, aesthetic, sociocultural issues that architecture engages, that the arts engage. Running parallel to those two, when I was 5, like when I was, yeah, probably around 5, I started playing guitar. And my dad plays guitar, and he was kind of self-taught. And I was 5. I had nothing better to do. He was just like, do you want to learn how to play guitar? I was like, yeah, sure. So he took me to some guitar lessons. I got hooked. Like, I've always had a deep, deep love for music, and I still do. I still make music, a variety of different genres, electronic mostly. So that was a kind of other thing that I was interested in studying. Actually, I was like, I wanted to go to music school, but I think one way or another, I also kind of veered away from it because I didn't want to institutionalize it. And my parents were also like, you need to be a bit more, I think, like realistic about what your professional goals are. Not to say that architecture makes a ton of money, obviously, but it does give a different kind of structure, right, to education and musical education would. So yeah, I ended up choosing architecture because we were doing some college visits. Like my dad and I were kind of like driving around the country, flying to a few places as well. I chose architecture because we landed in Brooklyn, in New York, and I felt immediately at home. Like it was super, super clear to me that I belonged there. The density of New York, the kind of neighborhood that Clinton Hill in Brooklyn was, where Pratt is. And of course, just like the diversity of like people, food, culture, music, everything. I mean, it's Brooklyn. Like it has literally everything you'd ever want. So I think it was really like site oriented for me. It was like very specific to a place. And I'm glad I chose architecture because of that, because it really is very linked, like urbanism, architecture, sociocultural values, and education in that is amazing. Like you can actually just walk out into the world and have a kind of different educational experience of it. So yeah, long answer, sorry.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Do you find any similarity in music and architecture?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, there's always the cliche of like architecture spurs music, everything like that, and there's a lot of critique around that. But there are absolutely parallels, undeniably, that rely around issues of structure, issues of syntax, and most importantly, issues of cultural baggage. Like, where does music come from what heritage, from what genre, from what nationality, ethnicity, and then its relationship to architecture. Like, they're just, for me, two things in parallel that are just like part of creative output. And my thesis in undergraduate dealt with issues of syntax and its relationship to like ontological space or space for worship or space for kind of like an intellectual pedagogy, like teaching you how to think about structure and syntax at the same time. Yeah, so those are definitely interconnected for me.
Mm-hmm. And what are some highlights which had a huge impact in your philosophy or personality from your experience at Pratt?
See, I think it was really cumulative, actually. I tried to, I think very early on, I realized that you can't like hold certain things too sacred or really get down on certain things because it was super, super bad, like have a bad review or like had an amazing review or something like that, or there's an amazing lecture. I think I quickly realized that holding those things in the highs and lows are kind of counterproductive and really kind of take things as they are and be always try to zoom out and kind of get perspective on. And that's really advice I comes from my mom. She's very, very good at like keeping perspective, like celebrate the highs and figure out why the lows are, you know, crappy and feel what you need to feel, but also like try to keep things in perspective and realize like, you know, this is a very continuous thing, architecture education, right? And it was very diverse too, which was great at a place like Pratt. I think there's like a huge diversity of paths, at least when I was going to school there, that you could take. You could be a hardcore modernist, or you could be like weird like me and go through a bunch of weird computational things and like get interested in philosophy, structure, stuff that aren't related to like, let's say, architectural history in a very conventional way. But yeah, very continuous for me, very like cumulative.
Mm-hmm. And why did you choose Bartlett for masters?
So the Bartlett was a place that I had always kind of been interested in, even when I was at school in Pratt. And that was much more like on a kind of surface level, right? Like I was an undergraduate, I was still like learning a lot about like how to produce geometry, images, tools, or use tools to do this sort of thing. So I saw the Bartlett and I was like, okay, this is really interesting work. I didn't really know much about it, obviously, because I like, how do you know about a school other than its images really and like course description stuff? You have to like meet the people, you have to figure out who's there, what the agendas are. And I was really interested in the Bartlett and as well as the AA. And there's a lot of shared kind of sensibility there when I was going to undergraduate, 2012, 2013. They've diverged, I think, with a decent amount of overlap still. But I basically chose the Bartlett after like, you know, getting out of undergraduate, working for a few years and really seriously evaluating what my role is or like what I want to do in education, in higher education, in the master's program. Because I knew if I was going to go back to school in the master's after working, I need to really know that I want to choose that school. And luckily, I got super lucky with Pratt. I could have chosen a school that I absolutely didn't like, but I had a fantastic education at Pratt. And I wanted to make sure that I could do that again, but not by chance, right? Like really know, do the research, figure out like why the Bartlett is good. And the Bartlett was the only place I applied to, and I got in, which is fantastic. Like I knew I just wanted to go here, and it's been great. It's been fantastic.
Nice. How does a typical day in your life look like?
That's a really hard question, which is really kind of silly because like I've lived like such a radically different lifestyle year to year to year since around 2015 or so. Like after 2015, like job searches and like we're living in different cities, different hours, like different rigors of studio. Like I worked for Morphosis right after school, and I like my typical day was not typical at all, right? Some days I would go home at 6 p.m. Some days I would go home at 1 a.m. because it was working on a competition and Morphosis, that like really kind of hardcore culture of studio working, which I like a lot. There are a few constants in my day. There's always coffee, which is, you know, obviously it's not that's not unique. And at some point in the evening, at some point, I need to be able to produce music or visuals that is outside of a job or outside of education. So in school, like whenever I have, you know, a day of work, even in COVID and everything like that, I'm working from home. At some point, whether maybe before dinner or after dinner, I sit down and I make some music, or I work on like other graphic project or another visual project or something like that. That's just personal that I can kind of zoom out and think about like, okay, what are the things at play here? So it's always, I think the typical lifestyle or the typical day in the life revolves around like a few constants that keep me kind of grounded, right? Coffee and visual production and sonic production.
Mm-hmm. So it's like a creative break or something which
Yeah.
relaxes you. Yep.
Absolutely.
If you can name one book which had the biggest impact in your life. What would that be and why?
It's not a book, it's actually a text by Michel Serres called The Origin of Language. And it's not like, it's just very good at kind of understanding or getting the reader to understand fundamental issues of syntax and structure. Like it's very deeply abstract. It's actually not ingrained in a kind of like sociocultural issue or particular like facet of life. It's not even really life advice, but I take it as like a kind of very applicable way to start thinking about problems in any context because it's very, very abstract, but it's also very clear. And it's just a very good read. I always kind of go back to it every couple of years. I read it in 2012, I think. And every year or so, I kind of just like refresh and kind of go back to it and be like, that's really interesting or something. Maybe it's helpful in getting myself unstuck from a problem or a way I'm thinking about something or an issue in life.
I know you mentioned earlier that you worked at Morphosis.
Mhm.
So can you elaborate on like for how many years or period you worked there and what was the reason you decided that you want to go for masters?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting time in my life. So right after school in 2016, I was starting to apply to jobs after my undergraduate, like first job basically, right? Like I'd done internships consistently every summer, and I'd worked for professors as well during the year. So I didn't really have any like full professional full-time work experience, right? So applying to a bunch of jobs, internships, stuff like that. Didn't get anything after like 2 months, and I was like really fed up. And I had applied to Morphosis, and one of my professors, Dagmar Richter, who was the chair at UCLA. Do you know her? Do you know Dagmar Richter?
No.
No, she was the chair of UCLA for about 9 years. Super super influential in academic architecture. She was teaching at Pratt, and I had her for a 400 level studio, doing a really really fun project. And she knew Tom Main personally because of UCLA, and they had kind of come up around the same time. They're around the same age. And she put me in contact. She sent my stuff directly to him, which is like fantastic. I got really lucky with that. I didn't hear anything back from the office or anything like that until 2 months after school, after I graduated, and I learned I got an internship, which is like really great. It's like, awesome, let's go. Most of the interns at Morphosis will work in the shop doing like 3D prints and model making and stuff like that. I was given a really, really nice chance to be in the advanced technology department, which deals with computation, but then also just like some competition modeling and geometry and stuff like that. So I got to do a bit of designing. I got to do some a set of art drawings with Tom, which was really, really fun for the Beirut embassy. And then, so that was only for 9 months, right? It was just a typical internship in Morphosis. I moved to Philadelphia after that because that's where my parents were. And I was looking for jobs there. And UPenn is in Philly. And Tom teaches in UPenn. And he had called me up, or rather his assistant called me up and was like, hey, we know you're in Philly. We need a TA. Do you want to co-teach with Tom? The student's like, yeah, awesome, sure, let's do it. So I was a graduate assistant for him afterwards. And he was in LA. So I was basically like running that studio week to week. And then he would come in, I think he came in 6 or 7 times over the course of the semester, and we do like check up crits and kind of like more final things. But that was an incredible experience. Like we were doing really big urban projects. They have to do with like really broad sociocultural issues. We were cited in LA. Some of them had to do with, one of them was an island actually off the coast, which is really interesting. Others to do with agriculture, others with transit, with infrastructure, big kind of urban project systems. So another like really, really great experience with Tom was over that semester where, we would have meetings over the phone, and then he would come as well, and we'd kind of like discuss where the projects are going. And he's just a really, really good guy. Like there are a lot of, I think, architects that are not lovely people. Tom is like a very, very nice person. And it's just because he has always been that way. Like he's always been kind of brought up as, you work for what you want, and it doesn't come from a ton of wealth. And he shows it. I mean, he's very like down to earth and a really, really nice person. So like that was just an absolute blast and a very good lesson, I think, in learning from someone who's as deeply as experienced as Tom. And there's no one like him, right?
Can you share challenges faced in your career and how did you
Yeah,
resolve it?
one big challenge, honestly, the only real challenge that I've had to face is like finding a job. Like it's so hard. It is insanely difficult to find a job. It's really about luck sometimes. Other times it's about, are you in the right place at the right time? Recommendations help. Having a strong folio helps, of course. But like I remember after I had moved back to Philly and I was teaching. And while I was teaching, I knew like, okay, after the semester's over, I need to find another job. And Tom was helping me out. He was giving me recommendations to people. He was calling up people in New York. And everybody in New York didn't need a junior designer that had 1.5 years experience. They all needed project managers with like 10 plus. They needed contractors. They needed structural engineers. They need senior designers. They need managers. So there's an issue of luck here. Other than that, I haven't really faced anything. Like I've had a very cushy life, to be honest. Like, no, I don't see very many challenges in school. I think like a big challenge was growing up, maybe like in Kansas. Like that wasn't super fun to be a brown person in like very, very country club white America. But at the same time, I had plenty of friends who like weren't like that. And that was later on, I think in high school, that I'm still really close with friends today who are just really great people. But, yeah.
And any mentors or role model who had a significant contribution in your life?
Definitely my parents, obviously, right? Like they're both architects, but also they're just amazing people that kind of set me up for so much, like culturally, intellectually, philosophically, socially, by exposing me to a bunch of stuff. Taking me and my sister to India was, an amazing cultural education for both of us to like see like what our heritage is. Because I think that's the case for a lot of second generation kids in the States who are from countries outside the US. That's a really important education. Yeah, and they still educate me today. I mean, like I have Zoom chats with them almost like every couple of weeks, and just we'll like talk about whether it's like current political issues, the pandemic, architecture, art, whatever you name it. Same thing with my sister. I mean, she's younger than me, but she's also kind of like a really good role model for me. She's engaged in social policy, is a fantastic cook, and is just like a really great person. So family, for sure, immediate family are great role models. Other than that, I would say the two professors who I had the privilege of studying under at Pratt, Danielle Willems and Ezio Blassetti, they run a practice called Meda Design. And they also teach like extensively at like a bunch of amazing schools. UPenn, they've taught obviously at Pratt, RPI, Cooper, they've taught at SciArc, Bartlett, where else? Just a bunch of places. And they're amazing. They're like an aunt and uncle or like godparents to me in school. Like they really, really took me in. They were super generous. They're also just like really fun to hang out with. Like they're just really, really like good friends of mine. And yeah, and I'd say that's those are like the main kind of mentors and role models that really like shaped me and like still teach me and like educate me in life, which is fantastic. But, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we'll now move on to curriculum and your projects section. Can you run us through your curriculum at Bartlett?
Yeah, so it was pretty straightforward. We had a few classes in our first, and so it's a 4-term program, the BPro program, year-long. In our first term, and I think in our second term as well, we had some classes on computation with C# and Unity, but that was just kind of like introduction and some early pedagogical stuff. The main curriculum centers around a design module and a theory module. So like that's it, right? It's really, really kind of bare essentials, and it's fantastic because it really lets you kind of focus in on what's at stake for both of those and let them run in parallel. So like the theory paper or the theory course results in a final paper, final thesis that kind of pairs with the design studio. And there are obviously teams doing each of these projects. So everybody kind of has their own, set of positions on the project and like what's important to them. And the theory paper is written over a course of like 2 semesters, and you really kind of do a lot of reading, but then also kind of begin to theorize the project. And there's like a nice feedback loop, as there should be between design and theory, that makes the design better, but also like re-energizes the way you think about theory and kind of like constantly feeds back. So that's been super, super great. And they've run my course instructors have run the studio and design, or the studio and theory modules, and I think in a really, really fantastic way. And it's just because of like years of experience, and they work together so well. And so it's been a great education from a curriculum standpoint.
Yeah. Would it be possible for you to elaborate on like in each term what course you did and what was the studio brief and output?
Yeah, so it's one long studio, right? It's one kind of thesis. So it doesn't really change structurally, I guess, too much from term to term. Our theory courses early on were like doing a lot of readings and then some kind of a literature review for a lot of those readings. But then other than that, it's mostly just been like, week by week, you do tutorials with your design instructor, you show them progress, like in a very standard way. And then theory is more sparse. Like we'd have check-ins with the theory paper. We'd have like a deadline for, 1,000 words for the abstract, for a rough draft for the final, that sort of stuff. And the studio brief hasn't really changed. It's just kind of evolved in relation to the project. And the projects are quite diverse in our studio. They have to deal with, but they all kind of deal under the issues of automation, social housing, and the kind of socioeconomics that surround it, or the socio-political issues that surround those two things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's just one studio which goes year long.
Yep.
Correct.
Yep.
I see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And can you talk us about what were the tools and key takeaways from the studio?
Yeah, so like the tools, I won't get into that too much. There's always kind of a variety of softwares for any good project. I don't think one or two or even three softwares can produce like a good project. Good projects come from like, better ideas, right? And like stances on tools and positions on tools. I can give you a list of tools, but I mean, it's the standard, right? It's like Rhino, Grasshopper, Unity, C#, 3ds Max, all the Adobe stuff, blah, blah, blah. It's inconsequential. What's most important, I think, are the takeaways here. And I think for me, this project and this year really kind of realigned my intentions as like a sociocultural practitioner, someone that like doesn't just produce architecture, design, or something like that, but produces culture and produces like a society. And like why that's important in relation to an architectural education, I think is previously, or it is in the previous part of this question, like the tools and everything like that. The tools are just the tools, but it's, for me, the biggest takeaway is like really finding the stance for structure, philosophy, perception, aesthetics, and all those things in the kind of context of politics, or in the kind of context of social housing, or whatever the issues are at play. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. And can you walk us through one of your project in detail? What was your approach, challenges faced, and final output?
Yeah, so our project is entitled Public Parts, and it deals with the use of automation and an AI that manages a gig-based platform for autonomous communal life. Basically, that means within a resocialized kind of housing space, you have architectural components that are reconfigurable. So they're reconfigured via this kind of like Kiva robot, which is this little kind of drone-like robot that basically moves these parts around and configures space on a kind of updated basis based on tasks, gigs, modes of life, the way you book space, the way you use space. Inside these parts, there are a series of components that house personal items, furniture, and things that are kind of generally owned by the population of housing, rather than saying like, I own this space and all my stuff in it, in a kind of typical social housing scenario. What else is important about that? That's kind of the crux of the project, right? I mean, it deals with automation, social housing, and the reconfiguration of space as it relates to those two things. Yeah.
Got it. And what are some course recommended textbooks you found quite useful?
So like we had some selected readings in our theory module early on. You can definitely say Red Stack Attack by Tiziana Terranova is a good one. Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway, and Assembly by Hart and Negri. Those are really, really fantastic texts for me. So Assembly is a book. Staying with the Trouble is a book as well, but we read a kind of excerpt of it. And Red Stack Attack is a paper. It's not very long. I think it's like 6 or 7 pages. It's quite short, but they all outline different stances on socialist and communist thinking within the kind of like current hyper-capital context, which can be really oppressive and kind of disenfranchising for just everyday people. The 99% of people. So none of them are really texts on architecture. They're all texts on politics and political structure and its relationship to humanity. And I'd say in the case of Donna Haraway, though, it's a really good example that looks at politics, that looks at socialism and tendencies of bodies of individuals, but it contextualizes it within life and biological life and like life on Earth. And it kind of does a really good job of decentering the human and thinks about how the human can participate in kind of like broader modes of existence in relation to other ecosystems, in relation to other people, in relation to other creatures, and kind of like the broader global context that we don't think of that much these days, right? The broader global context is typically referred to as like globalism and capitalism and markets and stuff like that. So that was a really good kind of refreshing take in our discipline, which really focuses on very structural kind of rigid issues of like sociopolitics. Yeah. Really good
And
texts. Really good texts.
what are some upcoming projects you are working on?
Many. I've got just personal projects. I've got some kind of graphics and type design stuff I like to do on the side. I'm going to be continuing kind of more self-initiated architectural projects I've done in the past. Now that I'm out of school, I have more time for that sort of stuff. Not competitions or anything like that, just like personal work that tries to push some of the agendas I've developed forward in school, and then also just thinking outside of school and like where else I can go with it. I think the big project for me next is actually something I've been talking to my mom about in the past, I'd say, a year or so, in that it's a project that centers around the idea of like an Indo-futurist world that asks the question, like, what if India was never colonized in its history? Like, what if it just kind of kept going as a prosperous nation or as a prosperous society? And I'm going to ask that ask that question in context to the diaspora, right? Because I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm not Indian by nationality. I didn't grow up there. I grew up in the States and in London and Western society. So for me, it's a kind of way of someone like me to get to learn more about my own cultural roots and try to decolonize a lot of the presuppositions I have about architecture at large, which is majorly or primarily a Western centric education, right? Like we are always educated in relation to modernism, and then we think of everything else as like kind of extracurricular or historical. And I would like to kind of challenge that notion, given all of the tools I have at my disposal, like computational, philosophical, and socioeconomic, and kind of reframe my own education, but then also just like try to give myself a further education about my own cultural roots, because I'm really kind of coming at it like a tourist in some ways. I have no point of reference for living in India, but I have lots and lots of experience observing it effectively and trying to live in it through like time I've spent there. Right? And then also just like through my parents' experience and like what they can teach me about their upbringing in school and the way they think about Indian architecture or architecture in India for the diaspora outside of India.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What kind of job profile you want to work once, like after you graduate?
Well, I'm applying to a handful of jobs right now, but mostly just like as an architectural designer. Not really trying to become a specialist in anything, I think. Yeah, it's actually kind of advice that, or something that Gilles says a lot, Gilles Retson from my studio, who's my instructor. I'm also working for him at the moment. He likes to say good architects are generalists. They have specialties, but they are generalists fundamentally. Like they are able to do many things and adapt to many situations. So like, I don't really have any interest in like becoming a computational designer or a specialist in computation or structure or particular things in aesthetics that are like very, very specific, because everybody I think has those kind of desires. But I think I try to, again, kind of zoom out always and be a generalist with all of the embedded specialties that come with just being a person and being like an architect that has interests in certain things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And can you briefly share us about the other architectural related master's program at Bartlett?
Mm-hmm. So I don't know a ton about the UD Urban Design Program, but from architectural design, that degree within the BPro, there's a kind of like wide range of studios you can take, or there are clusters. That's what they're called. The clusters all have kind of different focuses. Some have to do with issues of like craft and material production, its relationship to computation. Some deal with really large issues like socioeconomics and housing and automation, like the cluster I took, RC4. And then others deal with kind of just straight up automation. They deal with like how do mechanical things, digital things, and just automation at large deal with architecture? Like how do those two feedback? Yeah. And what else can I say about that? It's kind of difficult to talk about considering we haven't been in studio for so long. Like my only real reference for like what other studios are doing are like looking at the crits and watching the crits with the final product. It's something that's like that COVID has really kneecapped the education with, is that like we don't have studio culture anymore. Like I can't walk around and be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, oh, what are these people doing? And like ask people like, oh, what is this? What are you working on? Like, and then engage in a one-to-one kind of discussion. Because sure, we have online classes and everything like that, but we don't have online studio culture. Like that doesn't exist, right? So, yeah. That's what I can answer with, given my knowledge after COVID.
Mhm. What is the best piece of advice you have received till date?
I don't think I have an example of that, like verbal advice. I think the closest thing I have is kind of just like learning from those who inspire and mentor me, and then kind of following their lead to a certain extent. Like, what are they good at? How do they lead themselves as people and as creative professionals within kind of any field? I do remember, this isn't direct advice, but this was something that Tom Main had said at a lecture at UPenn when we were teaching there. He was giving a lecture during the semester, not to our studio, but to like just the general student population, like a regular architecture lecture. He had said something, and I'll paraphrase this, but basically he was saying, all you really have is your creative capital. Like the thing that you work on, the only thing that you truly own is like your creative output and the work that you put into it. Because if you're working in an office, you're always working for somebody else. And though you might be learning and kind of fostering your own kind of personal stances and stuff, it's not fully yours, right? The only thing you truly own is like your own creative capital, which I think is like fantastic advice for people that want to know what their standing is, and like what they need to know, like what can I do, what's my role, that sort of stuff. And it's actually a really beautiful sentiment in that it doesn't relate to popularity or Instagram or views or accessibility. It relates purely introspectively in a really positive way. I think it like forces you to ask the question, what is at stake for me in the project? Like, what is at stake for me as an architect, as a person, as a practitioner of culture, as an artist, as a human being in relationship to other people? Yeah, creative capital. That's what you own. Good advice from Tom Yen.
Can you share your piece of advice to students who plan to do a master's course from Bartlett or who are on the verge of applying to Bartlett? What can they expect and how would
Uh,
you prepare, like piece of advice that would help to get the best out of it?
for the research cluster that I took particularly, or Bartlett in general?
Whatever you want to advise on.
Mm. Yeah, it's a tricky question. I think it relates to the advice I was talking about, or the thing that Tom Main said. Like, I think it's what do you? It's not really a question for others to a certain extent to answer. Like, it's not really a question for me to give advice about someone else's education. I think like if you're doing an education, and now I'm speaking just from personal experience, like if you want to do an education in architecture, do a master's in architecture anywhere, I think you have to ask yourself, like, why am I doing it? And what it is, and people need to really figure out what it is that their political and kind of socioeconomic stances on architecture are. Because I think if we just look at programs and evaluate based on the image output, it tends to get a bit, or it doesn't really become architectural education anymore. It kind of just becomes like, I want to learn some tools and I want to learn what the images are to produce those, or what the images are that those tools produce. And then that's my architectural education. And I think that's pretty dangerous, right? And it's something that's popped up in the past, 8 or 9 years with just the advent of social media. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love social media. like it's fundamental to our generation and generations to come, for sure. But I would say, like, my advice is to just ask yourself why you're doing it. Like, really like level with yourself. Like, really sit down, maybe write something, maybe write a series of questions as to like why you're doing something, and then get feedback on it. Maybe like talk to your friends or family or your mentors and see what they think, what they have advice, what kind of advice they have for you. Because I think when you get general advice from people you don't know, it never really applies to a certain extent. I think advice is a very contextual thing for me. Yeah, sorry, long answer for what advice I would give.
No, actually, it's quite good. Like, it's thought provoking that you should first have a like zoom out view that why you want to do it, and then
Mhm.
instead of just okay, I this college is produce cool stuff, so I should
Yeah,
just go
yeah.
to yeah.
I think it's actually that's a really good example of like how the West colonizes the East in this kind of like educational situation. Like a lot of people from the East, a lot of my friends who are in India who are studying architecture look at Western schools and say like, oh, they're doing cool images. I want to do cool images too. And I'm sure you're familiar with this as well. To a certain extent, that's a really nice way of looking at it in terms of like, I want to broaden my abilities, find more tools that are at my disposal to create a more interesting architectural project. But I think the bigger question is like, why am I doing architecture in the first place? Is it to produce cool images that I can sell? Or is it because I want to have a sociocultural impact on maybe a small community or people around me in a very, very real way? I think we need to ask more questions of ourselves as architecture students, as politicians, rather than just as good designers, because it's actually not that hard to be a good designer these days. There are plenty of tutorials online. There are plenty of, I mean, we're saturated with images. We all know kind of like what a good image is at this point. And if you want an education in tools and aesthetics, I would just like scroll Instagram and then look at YouTube tutorials. You don't need to pay thousands of dollars to go to an education or to an institution to do that, right? Yeah. Why? That's the big question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the topic you discussed because I think inherently the system itself is such a way that in social media, every school is competing with each other, that who
Yeah,
can produce better and
for
more
sure.
attractive images. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's absolutely true.
so
Sure.
what are some tools, software applications you would recommend people to learn?
Well, I mean, maybe not tools, but like I would learn how to code, or at least I'm not a great coder. I'm not, but I understand I can do some rudimentary coding in Python, but I mainly work in Grasshopper and Python in Grasshopper. But the reason why I'm saying code is that it allows you to structurally think about problems in a very interesting way, in a very rational way, and that applies to many, many other things. I understand computational structure. Therefore, I have a better grasp on visual programming softwares like Grasshopper, for example. I didn't just pick up Grasshopper and load up YouTube for a parametric tutorial, right? Like that's besides the point. It's not about making things look a particular way. It's about structuring things in a very particular way. This kind of goes back to the origin of the language thing with Michel Serres, and that text is fantastic about just like talking about structure and syntax. Like, what are the things, where do they go, and in what relationship do they have to each other? Like, that's like fundamental for me. Other software I'd say to learn or I recommend, I mean, obviously you need some sort of 3D modeling platform or software, even if you're just coding within it. Like, I think part of our curriculum was Unity and C#, and we weren't modeling anything in Unity. We were just coding in Unity. Obviously, Rhino Grasshopper is much more flex, right? It's like you can model super, super explicit things in Rhino, or you can also kind of like do a messy hybrid of algorithmic modeling and parametric modeling, and then physical, or and then manual modeling in explicit modeling in Rhino. And then I would say, other than that, software should really be, you should be, and here's a quote actually from my mom, you should be software agnostic. That's a fantastic quote from my mom. And I think she told me that like in my first year of school, like, because I was like drooling over like Rhino and just like, this is it. Nothing else is going to come close to this. And granted, Rhino is a great piece of software. But she was like, yeah, but like broaden, like learn more software, or find other softwares that do weirder things, that do other things that are not like Rhino, and learn as much as you can. I think in terms of software, just because it'll give you like a much broader tool set and kind of creative output. But that being said, I mean, you don't need to learn a ton of software to be a good architect, obviously, right? You can learn enough such that you know how to execute a series of ideas in a particular way. And then after that, it's much more about like the architecture itself. Like, what are the big ideas at play for that piece of architecture? Yeah. Learn code, learn as much as you can. That's what I'd say. Short answer.
Mm-hmm. And is there any topic or area which we didn't discuss in this interview, but you would like to talk about? Any question you never get asked, but you would like to answer?
People don't normally ask me questions, so this has been a treat. Yeah, I think one like topic I want to talk about, architectures always have like a secondary parallel kind of obsession that runs in parallel with architecture. It's been super. I mean, it's been music for me. It's been ultra rewarding to look at these two things and cross-examine these things in relation to the kind of third thing, which is the world and like socio-political contexts and culture and that sort of stuff. So like for me, it's this kind of triad of architecture, design, music, and then culture. And then like media and art and stuff like that kind of flows between those three things. So I'd say to any architect that wants to kind of like I think open their world up a bit more so they're not just hanging out with other architects, is like look at a different creative discipline that allows you to reframe architecture and allows architecture to reframe that discipline, because it's very, very rewarding as an architect, but then also as like the producer of that other discipline. So if you're an artist, I would let art, I mean, obviously there are ties between those two, but maybe like go farther out, maybe go to film or dance or poetry or something like that, and see how those two things kind of influence each other.
How can our listeners follow you and your work?
On Instagram, it's Akara, Aakara. Same thing, .net for my website. And then SoundCloud as well, same username. It's Aakara, which means form in Sanskrit, like old ancient Indian language. You know, I don't need to explain to you. And I came up with that, or I just decided to start calling the work I do and like the music I make under that name, like really early on. I think like first year or something, one of my professors is like, you need to set up a website so you can like use that as a platform, which is like great advice circa 2011 when a lot of people didn't have that, even though there were architectural websites around then. Yeah, you can find me at Aakara pretty much on every platform. Thank you. See you later.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.